ゲームじゃない感じに仕上げたいっていうような、ゲームなんですけど、ゲームやってたっていう感じよりもなんか違うものが残ってほしいなっていうような、感覚ですかね。僕ほら、例えばゲームっていろんなものがあるし、スポーツゲームもあれば、パズルみたいなのもあるしっていう、そういうものの、なんていう要素をもう何でもかんでも吸収しちゃうようなゲームなところがあるので、ゲームをしてるんだけれども、いろんなことの体験をしてって最後にその物語全部が集約し、一つ終わりを迎えるみたいな、そういうような遊びともつかないしゲームともつかないし、何だったんだろうこれは、なんかその疑似体験としてなんか面白いものを経験しちゃったなみたいな、そういう感覚で終われるものになってくれればいいなといつも思ってますね。だからゼルダは何でも吸収できるし、何をやってもゼルダとも言えるし、うまいことをやらないとゼルダと言ってもらえないみたいな変な側面もあるし、なんかね、変な不思議なゲームです。はい。
Eiji Aonuma's 5 directed Zelda games are a very over-discussed topic, like, in general. For reasons that we're going to get into, it's important to a lot of people to control the narrative about them, which you might also suspect this video is going to be an attempt at. What I would say is that these games are not perfect. They've got filler and problems. Even if they didn't, the medium is still very young, so making grand declarations about it wouldn't be enduring or impressive. So for the longest time, I never felt the need to say anything. But I realize now that most Zelda fans understand small surface level things, but in the end, they just can't see the forest for the trees. The director's intended interpretation ends up getting the same amount of focus and respect that some fan theory would. They like it, they think it's fun, but optional. Some people still believe it to be unfounded. Nobody's as angry as they really should be. They seem to think that everyone is just entitled to their opinion, which is textbook cowardice. I thought that I could organize things a little better, but I really can't afford to. I promise by the end of it, I really do address everything, but I won't explain it in ludicrous detail, because I'm not trying to sell you on a stupid fan theory. None of this is a theory. It's not apologetic in any way, and it isn't my opinion poorly disguised as a retrospective. This is simply The Legend of Zelda as it was intended by Eiji Aonuma. Now, before I say anything about anything, I need to address all the common misconceptions that I possibly can. For Zelda, the very best source of misconceptions is Matthew Matosis, a painfully condescending YouTube critic.
The story sets itself up to be a prequel to every other Zelda game to date, but doesn't accomplish anything with it. The most shocking revelation in the game is that Zelda is actually the reincarnated form of the goddess Hylia, a character who had never even been mentioned before until the intro to Skyward Sword.
Starting with the basics, the very first Zelda timeline can be found all the way back in 1991 in this Famitsu article. A Link to the Past is mostly Takashi Tezuka's game, but the first manual was penned by Koizumi, who would later direct the first 3D Mario titles. This was just before Aonuma was officially hired, and in the manual you get to see a lot of different things that Koizumi and Aonuma would eventually work on together in their earliest forms. But I'll just show the timeline here first.
Okay, so you've got Zelda 3 at the top, and then it says the original Zelda makes her first appearance. And then it also says Link's ancestor, ? Then after that it just says Nagai Nengetsu, I think, which is just like a long period of years and months. That's all it is.
It's interesting here that Koizumi is saying A Link to the Past is a time jump prequel to Zelda 1. Aonuma must have really loved this idea, because when he was brought on, he repeated it. Twice. When we get into later the boundaries of Aonuma's creative control, this will be an important thing to go back over because it shows the line between what he inherited and how he retooled it to fit his purposes. In 2002, following the release of The Wind Waker, Aonuma would give this quote in a GamePro article. The GamePro article itself is lost to time from what I can tell, but it's been archived in this issue of Nintendo Power. Where does The Wind Waker fit in the overall Legend of Zelda timeline? In terms of the storyline, we've decided that this takes place 100 years after the events in Ocarina of Time. We think that as you play through the game, you'll notice that the beginning of the story explains some of the events in Ocarina of Time. You'll also find hints of things from Ocarina of Time that exist in The Wind Waker. There's also a more complicated explanation. If you think back to the end of Ocarina of Time, there were 2 endings in that game in different time periods. First, Link defeated Ganon as an adult, and then he actually went back to being a child. You could say that The Wind Waker takes place 100 years after the ending in which Link was an adult. Now that's pretty descriptive on its own, but if you need proof of his consistency on this issue, he says a similar thing in an interview he gave to Nindry in 2006 to coincide with the release of Twilight Princess. Fair warning, I can't read Japanese, and Google Translate doesn't handle it very well. Windtact is parallel. Isn't it back to the childhood when Link flies to the world 7 years later at Ocarina and defeats Ganon? Twilight Princess is a world 100 and several years after a peaceful childhood. In the last scene of Ocarina of Time, Link and Princess Zelda come back as children to have a conversation. It is this story that the story's result is a little dragging that the relationship between the three with Ganon goes in different directions. In the middle of the work, there's a scene where Ganon is executed. If you leave him alone, he will be executed because he is a sacker to do ridiculous things later. So that scene is a few years after Ocarina. So the executed Ganon was sent to a world, and this time trying to get that power. There's plenty of old message boards of people reacting to the Famitsu article getting published elsewhere, most famous of which is AVGN's video, which he published on Cinemassacre.com in 2009. It's so weird to me that timeline deniers nowadays try to retroactively say that the chronology was somehow made up for Hyrule Historia in 2011. It's something that Aonuma had discussed for 2 decades at that point, and everybody else at the time was clamoring about it. It's probably the easiest lie to disprove that you could think of. I also found a Reddit post showing a magazine from October 2011 out of context in order to say that the timeline still isn't official. Meanwhile, Hyrule Historia released in December 2011. So it was a secret in October, but by December it was no longer a secret. I don't think that anyone actually bought this one, but I thought I would mention it while we're here because it's pretty funny.
At the start of the Minish Cap, there's an opening sequence detailing a previous incarnation of Link and shows that he wasn't wearing a hat. In the grander scheme of the Zelda timeline, the Minish Cap was basically an origin story for Link's hat, which was a fun idea. It was executed extremely well, and by the end of the game it was nice to know that the hats of the various Links worn through the years were a sort of unknowing tribute to Eslo. Skyward Sword undoes the entire point of this game. If Skyward Sword actually cared at all about being faithful to the timeline, then Link wouldn't be wearing a hat, which would have been an extremely easy change to make, and might have even made his design more interesting.
I won't get into this too much in this video because we're focusing on Eiji Aonuma's directed Zelda games and his story intentions for them. But yes, he does include games on his chronology that he had zero involvement in, and that much is a little confusing, understandably. I'm not going to say that these games aren't canon to each other, but if you think about it, or even if you don't, there's no possible way that these games could ever have any significant story connection. That's not what the timeline is about. The timeline is about how Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword all would connect to Ocarina and Majora. As Eiji Aonuma developed his story, these were the only parts that he was really concerned about. There's 100-year time jumps between each hero, stretching 200 years. And the implication when you create any story with time jumps is that the events in between aren't significant. Nothing can happen after Ocarina of Time for a while because Ganon is sealed away, and etc., etc. So, these other games on the timeline, again, I'm not saying they aren't canon, but they are superfluous, which is supported by the fact that nobody ever mentions the Minish or Vadi or any of that stuff. None of this is confusing as long as you have a basic comprehension of time travel and you don't poke holes in it like a contrarian.
If they use the same logic as the Song of Storm scenario, then the plants would always be grown in the future because the game would assume that young Link would plant them in the past. If the Song of Storm scenario worked by the logic used on the plants, then the guy couldn't possibly have taught Link the song in the future, until young Link played it in the past. Basically, all of this is to say that the time travel in Ocarina of Time probably wasn't thought out to a huge degree, and the developers simply went with whatever they thought was a good idea for certain parts of the game. When you look at the Magic Beans and the Song of Storms, they're both good ideas and I like the way they play with the time travel. The problem is they're incompatible with each other.
What Matthew really wants when he says that Minish Cap is a better prequel than Skyward Sword is for fans to be able to make creative changes to the story, and not the person directly responsible for that story. And well, that's problematic.
The reveal that Tetra is Zelda is perhaps the least thought out moment in any Zelda story ever. As soon as she's revealed to be the princess, the King of Red Lion starts referring to her as Zelda for no reason. Presumably names in the Zelda universe work the same way they do in the real world. Presumably Tetra has been going by the name Tetra for as long as she's been alive. It's even left ambiguous about whether or not she knew about her heritage at all, so why then is she suddenly renamed Zelda as soon as she discovers her lineage? This alone might not seem so bad, maybe we could assume that her name was Zelda all along and Tetra just an alias, but her clothes are suddenly replaced and she seems to undergo a complete personality change. She's no longer a freewheeling, aggressive pirate, but suddenly seems to be a refined, caring princess. Even if we go out on a limb and assume that Zelda's personality somehow awakened inside of Tetra, then that's a pretty terrible fate in and of itself. It's as though Tetra was just a vessel to be overwritten.
Does it not occur to Matthew that just because an event takes place later in the story, that doesn't necessarily mean that the storyteller came up with it later? I mean, think about it. Even if you don't know anything about Zelda, this information is obviously important to the ending of the game. He says that this moment isn't thought out, but he doesn't provide any evidence for that claim. Does he know who created the story? Can he provide evidence that they didn't think about it? Obviously not. He's just saying that to him, the scene doesn't feel like it was thought out. By definition, this can't be a shoehorn if that's what he always planned to do. I mean, it's made up, but everything's made up. So yeah, Tetra isn't real, Zelda isn't real. These are fictional stories. Again, what is this guy even talking about?
The more likely answer is this is simply a shoehorned reference to Ocarina of Time, one of many that are in the Wind Waker for seemingly no reason at all. There's no time travel in the Wind Waker, Link has no connection to the previous one apart from his clothes, the game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. Overall, the references to the Hero of Time and all that stuff feel pretty forced, and the Koroks and the Rito are the two worst examples. The idea of setting a game and was essentially a post-apocalyptic scenario of Hyrule is wonderful, but its attempts to continue on from Ocarina of Time seem incredibly half-assed and not very well thought out.
It's pretty inappropriate to say that the races in Wind Waker need to have firmer connections to their Ocarina counterparts in order to be a fitting conclusion to the story. Their connections are loose on purpose. They had to endure the onslaught of a reawakened Ganon and then a giant flood. It's completely believable that they lose the majority of those ties. Actually, this is just a total misunderstanding of not only the plot, but also the themes and morals of the game. The moral and the whole point of the Wind Waker is that you should accept the past for what it is and build a better future. All the people, Hylians, Rito, Koroks, they've all shed their connections to the old world, and they live in peace above the waves, just as the gods wanted. Ganon insists that this was a cop-out and that the gods refused to save their people, but it's not true, they did what they could. Ganon's whole motivation in this game is to destroy the new world in wake of reviving the old one. He's protecting his heritage to the detriment of everyone else alive. You don't need an art book recapping that information to understand it. It's explicitly told to you in dialogue. And again, none of this is a fan theory, it's just what's in the games. Going back to what I said earlier about extraneous titles, Matt even complains about Phantom Hourglass for this very reason.
The ending to the game sees Hyrule washed away with the kids' future left in their own hands. We know now that the story continues on in two direct sequels to The Wind Waker, those being Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, but taken on its own, I think this would have made a fitting ending to the entire Zelda saga. Games could have still been set before The Wind Waker to allow the series to continue, and some are, but The Wind Waker itself would have made a nice conclusion to the series as a whole. Ganon, Hyrule and the Master Sword are all lost beneath the waves, and life moves on. It would have made for a nice ending.
He catches it here, but again, he's only applying this logic when it suits his opinion.
It would almost be as incredibly stupid as the King of Hyrule passionately telling the children at the end of The Wind Waker that their new land won't be Hyrule, because he wanted the past washed away. And then, within a few years, they discover a new continent. Guess what they call it?
Adding any kind of character depth or world building or some other literal element, you might take that as an improvement to the story, but actually it makes it less concise. Instead of it being about this emotional tug and pull about the morality of family versus future, you're erasing that and just boiling Hyrule down into any other fantasy world that you would use to escape your adult responsibilities. The point is instead to take these morals to heart and apply them to your adult life. Lorne Lanning, I think, is one of the first game developers to actually take himself seriously. In the 90s, he was forced to make a bunch of games out of contract, but now that he's gotten out of that contract, he's finally self-publishing, so he can take his time between releases. Most developers, like Eiji Aonuma for example, don't have that luxury, because the authority of an artist's influence on a work is considered a threat to the authority of a corporation who only sees art as an entertainment product. Which is especially pernicious in computer games, because the entire industry right now is centered around the idea that games are only escapist toys. When Lanning conceived Oddworld basically as a movie, he turned the idea into a video game for budgeting reasons.
That's amazing. Let's make 5 movies. And I was like, no, we're going to make 5 games because 5 movies is going to cost at least $500 million. And who's going to give us that? Nobody. But we could get maybe $25 million to make 5 games at less than $5 million a piece. And she was like, oh, you suck. You're just like, I just have no interest in making games. I win awards and I make movies and I love films and games is just violence and it's this and that. I was like, games is a lot of things and it's going to be a lot more things and you don't really know. None of us can tell what it's going to be yet. But ride this with me for a second. This is what's going to happen. These systems are going to come in, it's going to change the medium, and you know what? The medium of games, they don't know how to do large productions yet. They don't know how to manage 150 people on a team, but we do. So we have that going for us.
Executives don't expect as much out of game devs as they do movie directors, which afforded him a lot of leniency. Some would probably be offended by the idea that games could be treated as though they were low-budget movies, but this approach allowed him to pioneer, while also cheating his homework off of the movies that he really liked. I'm not going to say that presentation isn't important, because it is important, but as far as getting your foot in the door, most people will just take what they can get. The people who end up pushing the frontier of technologies, in the beginning they were just industrious storytellers who wanted to have their story told, by whatever means necessary. They're just trying to get their point across, the story, of course, being the ultimate point.
I'm not fond of the heavy emphasis on story in Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, as I think it all too often breaks up the gameplay and gets in the way of the whole reason people play the games in the first place. The story never really should be the draw, just a little something to urge the player on.
Because when I talk at length about why the story in The Legend of Zelda is so important, I'm not talking out of my ass. This is the entire reason Eiji Aonuma became a developer. This is the entire reason most people become artists. It's the singular thing that they wanted to do. So yes, Zelda games exist as stories first, and games second, which, by the way, isn't a flaw, it's a strength.
All the references to the Hero of Time and all that stuff feel pretty forced. Its attempts to continue on from Ocarina of Time seem incredibly half-assed and not very well thought out. Then that's a pretty terrible fate in and of itself.
What Matt is really trying to say is that he believes that there's no way Aonuma could have possibly cared or kept track of all these things, but as I'm gonna show, Aonuma absolutely did keep track of the details. Speaking of details, let's look at another character who has his true identity revealed to him.
This section of the game is where the Zant stuff finally goes off the rails. He had only been seen rarely before this point, but he was shown to be a restrained and creepy villain who managed to be pretty intimidating. Had they kept this up, he could have easily substituted as Ganon for the game's main villain. Zant's character is flushed down the drain in the space of a minute, and it turns out he's just another boss to defeat on the path to the real villain, Ganon. I don't think there was any point to establishing Zant as a villain at all if he was going to be replaced at the end of the game with Ganondorf.
I'm not going to harp on it too much right now, but you should at the very least understand that all fictional characters are nothing more than metaphors, and they are, in fact, at the disposal of the larger story.
Freewheeling, aggressive pirate, strained and creepy villain who... It's as though Tetra was just a vessel to be overwritten. Zant's character is flushed down the drain.
This isn't a flaw, it's just how stories have been told for thousands of years. a fun, unique side character is never going to take precedent over the larger story.
Tetra allows Link to get on board the pirate ship, and by this point you've probably figured out that she's Zelda. In Ocarina of Time they pulled this trick as well, but it was far more unexpected because Sheik was so different from how you would imagine Zelda to be, and because they hadn't had a twist like that before. Nobody who played Ocarina was about to be fooled twice. It's not a big deal, but it begs the question of why they even bothered, or why they didn't try to do something a bit different. This is a tough balance to maintain, however, and after the complaints from some people that Majora's Mask and The Wind Waker were too different, it was probably inevitable that Nintendo would eventually produce something too close to the Ocarina of Time mold. Back in the days of Ocarina and Majora, Nintendo clearly didn't care about crafting an overarching timeline for the Zelda series.
I'm going over many interview quotes later, of course, but you don't have to know the entire history of everything to understand that Eiji Aonuma is the originator for these story concepts. That much is self-evident if you simply read one or two interviews, because he's always the one that gives detailed and lengthy answers to story questions, talking about things he could only know if he was. As I've been showing, at no point in these videos does Matt have any curiosity about the storytelling purposes of anything. He has a hunch that Tetra being Zelda wasn't thought out, but he never did any research, or he would find out that he was wrong. He also has a hunch that Tetra and Zant were originally meant to carry over into the third act of the story, replacing Zelda and Ganondorf, but he never did any research, or he would have found out he was wrong. And he keeps droning on about how Nintendo did this or Miyamoto did that. He's just making it abundantly clear that he has no insight on who actually came up with the story that he hates so much. The only way that anyone could miss important details like this, like Tetra obviously always being Zelda, or Zant obviously always being Ganondorf's heir, is by completely missing the intended reading of the text, which you can either do unintentionally because you misunderstand the story at face value, or intentionally to mislead people even though you actually do understand the overarching story. Now, which one does Matt fit into? You might be shocked.
According to the story, the world was formed by three goddesses who are also responsible for creating the Triforce. This story has no bearing on the game in the slightest and could have been swapped out with any mystical backstory you could think of. We don't get any reason why the Triforce itself would exist, just that it was left behind after they were gone. These events are so far removed from the things that actually happen in the game that they might as well have not been included. I'm all for fleshing out the world, but this doesn't tell us anything about Hyrule or any of the people living in it that we didn't already know. It just confirms that some goddesses made the world, not a big deal.
Now, I could nerd about this, but then he skips over the part where Zelda recaps it later. And then when Ganon seizes the Sacred Realm, like they had been talking about the entire time, he says this.
The Ocarina of Time opens up the Temple of Time, where the game will skip forward 7 years into the future. There's a bit of an unnecessary cutscene where Ganon tells how this was his plan all along, blah blah blah, and then a bit more exposition.
Just as it was in Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, none of this stuff is optional to the story of Ocarina of Time. Matt wants to have his cake and eat it too, where he can ignore the story, because according to him it doesn't matter, but then when the story reaches a climax, and suddenly all of those things do gain relevance, suddenly it's this weird thing that comes out of nowhere. The truth is, it never came out of nowhere. Matt just wasn't paying attention. Like, check this one out.
But this is just one element of a much larger game, and regardless of how you feel about the visuals, it's worth considering how well The Wind Waker stands up as a Zelda game, and as a game in general. It starts out on the appropriately named Outset Island with
No, it doesn't start on Outset Island. I mean, you know full well that it doesn't. This intro explains all the supposed problems that Matt has with this story, and this is on the GameCube version where you can't even skip the cutscenes, so you've had to deliberately edit that footage out of your recording. I can't believe people take this guy seriously when he thinks that he can make a 40-minute video claiming to have some kind of insight on The Legend of Zelda, meanwhile every single blasted thing he says about this story doesn't contain any information in it. Matt, not only are you missing the entire point of the whole story, you're doing it on purpose. You know what the story is. You've proven that you know.
We're told that Ganon has basically won. He's got his hands on the Triforce and took over the Sacred Realm. Link got sealed away for 7 years so he could grow old enough to take him on. From here on out, most of the game is played as adult Link in the future, and it's a great idea for the plot. In most action-adventure style games that revolve around saving the world, you're given some idyllic place that needs protection, or a post-apocalyptic world where the struggle of the people compels you to try and help them. Either of these scenarios can only be so effective because we're left wondering about what exactly it is we're trying to prevent, or what exactly it is we're trying to restore. As soon as you walk into Hyrule Town 7 years on, Ocarina of Time has answered both of these questions. You have an immediate comparison in your mind of what Hyrule should look like and what it does look like now.
You have very good reading comprehension. Just because from Tetra's point of view all of this is mysterious, that doesn't mean the player doesn't know who Zelda is. Tetris wasn't alive 100 years ago. She obviously doesn't know who Zelda is. That doesn't mean that this moment is out of character. We, the audience, do know who Zelda is. Her name's on the title screen. The only reason you wouldn't apply this logic to the Wind Waker is if you were being deliberately disingenuous to serve your opinion.
You have an immediate comparison in your mind of what Hyrule should look like and what it does look like now. The game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. What Hyrule should look like. The game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. What Hyrule should look like and what it does look like now. Well, not as we know it anyway. And what it does look like now.
But as previously established, the moral at the end of The Wind Waker is that you should accept the past for what it is and build a better future. Twilight Princess, being an alternate ending to the story, is now inverting that moral. Now, Link is the one protecting his heritage and saving his family, and Ganondorf is the one creating a future for himself in spite of his past. The shoe's on the other foot, but interestingly, Ganondorf is still in the wrong. This is the thematic purpose behind the timeline. At this point, I really have no patience for the people who pretend like the timeline is inconsequential or confusing, because its purpose here is obvious. Twilight Princess is a poetic inversion of Wind Waker. That's the whole reason that they're both sequels to Ocarina of Time. Now you're able to explore, on an emotional level, both sides of the same coin. It's fun and interesting, and it's very sad that a lot of people just can't be bothered. But anyway, how does Aonuma pull all this off? Well, Zant is the key here. Notice that Zant doesn't have to beg Ganondorf for powers or anything. Ganondorf actually comes up to Zant. Let's think about this for 2 seconds. Why Zant? Well, Zant must be special, right? Remember how Tetra is the next Zelda after her mother? Well, here, Zant is the heir to the Lost Gerudo Patriarchy. He's the third male Gerudo after Groose. Once again, this stuff would be totally obvious if Matt simply read the text on screen. You know, thank God it's actually on screen this time. If this was really a retrospective, like it says in the title, wouldn't it contain information that Matthew would only have access to in retrospect? You know, like an art book that explains the story in black and white detail. But no, just to make sure he's been contrarian to every single point made by Hyrule Historia, since that's the true reason he made these videos, he's going to insist that Zant was always supposed to be the main villain of Twilight Princess. With no evidence, mind you. I mean, seriously? I'm not trying to be mean, but you don't have to make fun of these videos. They just make fun of themselves.
It may be a case they only made this decision because they knew many players would be replaying the game and thus would be ready for hard mode, but I hope they seriously consider this for the next Zelda. At the end of the game, you're taking on multiple Darknuts at once, who do several hearts of damage if they manage to connect.
There's a concerted effort by Matt to overgeneralize and downplay everything, not just the story. He's constantly acting like he's too good for the game. And if that's how you feel about video games, that they should have to earn your attention and respect, you know, that's a matter of personal taste. You can like whatever you want. But don't delude yourself into thinking that attitude makes you superior to everyone else. Now, like I said, most fans these days already know most of this. Matthew is a huge outlier. But at the end of the day, even the fans who are aware just aren't seeing the bigger picture. So we need to keep zooming out. And there's a huge prerequisite before you can truly appreciate Twilight Princess as the first proper revision to Zelda's chronology.
Oh man. Yeah, I think this is going to be a fun playthrough. Anyone here never see this? Also, thank you for the host, Mike. Hi, everybody. Oh, so there's a lot of people who have never played this game. I think you'll enjoy this. This is going to be one of those playthroughs I think you might remember for a little while. Not because of me, but because of the game. It's just one of those games. So, really nice look at the world. For anyone who's getting Legend of Zelda vibes, it's a pretty damn different game, aside from just a couple of visual similarities and sword. And horse, and bridge, and castle. And bow, and climbing. Oh, and Zelda is in this. And Link. And Epona. And Ganon. Alright, I'll stop.
Fumito Ueda is intentionally pulling from Eiji Aonuma in multiple important points in both Ico and in Shadow of the Colossus. And Eiji Aonuma is intentionally pulling from Fumito Ueda in multiple important parts in Twilight Princess, in Skyward Sword, and even as early as The Wind Waker. So, no, Vinny, their similarities are not superficial. Ico was essentially a love letter to Ocarina of Time, and Shadow of the Colossus has a load of distinctly intentional references to Majora's Mask. Aonuma is referencing Ueda as a reciprocation of Ueda's own references to him. This is about two artists coming to an emotional agreement about something. The comparison currently on screen alone proves that they were not only good friends and have a strong relationship, but that they were actively bouncing ideas off of one another and making notes in each other's margins. Comparing side by side like this isn't revealing something shallow like their favorite flavor of ice cream, it's corroborating evidence of their authority in their own work. The big one that I always think of is this one, the spiral staircase inside the tower. Aonuma wants you to think about Yorda from Ico, and he wants you to compare Yorda in that game to Zelda's role in this game. A pale, fragile girl hiding in the shadows. And that's exactly why Ganondorf's first phase is fighting Zelda as a puppet.
Le coquelot ignorant.
For anyone who's getting Legend of Zelda vibes, it's a pretty damn different game, aside from just a couple of visual similarities.
Unfortunately, Shadow of the Colossus exists in public consciousness right now, exclusively for early 2000s nostalgia farming, and nobody, including Vinny, bothers to recognize that its whole existence is as a sequel to Ico. You're lucky if they mention Last Guardian, if only to parrot some IGN-esque complaints at it. And to say that Ueda has been disrespected by Western audiences would be a huge, huge understatement. And it's not alone. Actually, a lot of amateur artists who became interested in the medium at the time went for the PS2, because finally their work wouldn't have to be treated like toys. Like Lorne Lanning, for example. He started on the PS2.
What was also on the horizon was Sony PlayStation. So Sony was saying, we're going to get into the game business. And that was kind of out there a couple years before the PlayStation launch, at least. And that's when I thought, this is really going to get interesting, because for the first time, we're going to have a real, true entertainment company get into the game business as a player, and not just a toy company. And that's how I saw Sega and Nintendo, was toy companies. And I don't mean that in any derogatory or condescending way. I just meant they saw their market, and they didn't believe in things like sequels. Check this out, right? So we're going around and talking to game publishers and stuff, and I'm trying to tell them how we're going to build a series, and because I'm just following, like, what does X-Files do? What did Disney do? What did the sequels? Is all Hollywood's about. In games, they were thinking, and this is in 1993, 94, 95, they're going, there's no money in sequels. The sequel only sells at best half as much as the original hit, so we don't really bank on it. And I saw that, I was like, there's one of our moments. There's one of my George Lucas, Walt Disney moments. They don't believe in sequels, which means they don't believe in brand, which means they still thinking about it like it's the toy industry. You know, you come out with Cabbage Patch Kid, but you can't milk it to death, right? Barbie lasts forever, Hot Wheels last forever, Legos lasted forever, but everything else tends to be largely come and go. So the toy industry thought more in this way of, you come up with a toy, if it can be a hit, you ride it, you milk that cow for all it's worth, and then you got to come up with a new one. And games was still thinking that way.
Eiji Aonuma's relevance to all this is that he got stupid lucky and blazed a trail, which is why Fumito Ueda respected him so deeply.
Now, Nintendo, maybe not, because they already had the legacy of Mario and Donkey Kong and things like that, and they were Zelda. And so I don't know, because I wasn't interfacing with Nintendo, but I was talking to others.
These other artists who got their start on PS2 games, like Lorne Lanning, Fumito Ueda, and even Hideo Kojima, were all following in Aonuma's footsteps. Like I said earlier, this is the entire reason that people like this became developers and became artists. It was always what was most important to them and what they wanted to do with their lives. The consistent problem in all these cases is that life isn't simple. We're going to get into later one of the main causes of life's problems, but you should immediately understand that Abe's Odyssey, Ico, and the first Metal Gear are all extremely unfinished games, and their sequels don't fare any better. Real artists in the game industry are fighting an uphill battle against executives and programmers, and these games don't accurately reflect the artists that made them. As a direct result, the people who gain an attachment to those things will almost always do so under mistaken impressions. These really are amateur projects, there's no getting around that. The people who make up the vocal fanbase for this stuff always has a knee-jerk reaction to any kind of revision whatsoever. The earlier titles that these artists had worked on had less emphasis on story due to logistical problems. These audiences preferred when the story had less emphasis, not because their perceived insights were correct, but because they are so insecure they simply can't confront these emotions, even in fiction, and they prove it with how they behave. The vocal fans for Shadow of the Colossus only really enjoy Shadow of the Colossus as a t-shirt design they got it from Hot Topic. It's still a toy to them. They're not going to play the rest of the series to get the rest of the story, and they're not going to read an interview to understand the story better or anything, because to them, Shadow of the Colossus is and will always be just some PS2 game they liked when they were a kid.
They don't understand yet. It's going to be brand IP and sequels. But that means it's got to be deeper, richer universes. And in the shit you're currently delivering, I understand why you don't believe in sequels. Because that story sucked. No one gives a fuck about your story because it sucks. If it wasn't good play, your character sucks because you don't have any character development. And so I was very critical of what the characters were in games. Not that I wasn't enjoying them, but when you put it up to a Hollywood standard of character development, character arc, what's happening across the multi-act structure, you had a whole different analysis of what constituted a popular character. So does Mario turn into a good movie? It's a fucking terrible movie, right? It's a terrible movie because it's not there to begin with, right? Does Ratchet and Clank make a good movie? I love Insomniac. Why would you make a movie out of Ratchet and Clank? How deep is the fabric of those characters? How many other game movies did we just give no depth that we expect from movies? So they brought to the movie the same superficiality that's in the game, except what they had the game going for it was good challenge. Now it's just a challenge to watch, right? So for me, I was like, if we build really rich characters with really rich, deep stories that aren't what you expect, so they have the ability to possibly cut through, then they might have a longer life. And as the game industry matures, then maybe they can hit the big time. Then maybe they can, really have their name in lights.
Nintendo fans do this even more than anyone else. Before Hyrule Historia, people were already against the idea of any Zelda timeline, saying that Nintendo doesn't have an official timeline and they just made it up. Now that it is out, they're retroactively trying to say that Nintendo only came up with it in 2011, which is impossible. The complaints themselves existed before 2011. And anyway, if something was important enough to you that you felt the need to complain about it on the internet, doesn't that prove that it matters? It clearly got a reaction out of you. You see a similar thing with how Sonic fans reacted to the whole Two Worlds thing, but that's its own video essay. The reality is, their reactions don't hinge on whether or not these things were always there, or if they were consequentially important. What these types of audiences aren't willing to admit is that they're automatically hostile to the mere concept of there being an overarching story in the first place.
This one is a sequel to Ocarina of Time, but wait, not a sequel to the end where adult Link defeats Ganon, no, it's a sequel to young Link after he got sent back. So now, any speculation of Nintendo ever making a sequel to Zelda 2 is deader than shit. They can't even make a sequel that follows in consecutive order. Instead, they just keep going back, and then maybe taking a small step up again, and then back again. We have a sequel to the original, a prequel to the original, a sequel to the prequel, a prequel to the prequel, and a sequel to the young Link of the prequel's prequel. What the fuck?
The really weird part about all this is that this level of tackiness is pretty off-brand for Vinny. Actually, watching Vinesauce in 2012 was one of the things that really hooked me on Zelda lore in the first place. Vinny makes sure to slow down and read all the NPC dialogue like signposts. Vinny plays these games correctly, unlike Matthew Matosis, and the results speak for themselves.
It goes like this. All right, there's 3 separate timelines that branch off of Ocarina of Time. So, here's how it goes. I want to explain because it's very interesting. I just learned some more little details in Hyrule Historia. So, 3 different timelines. In one of the timelines, when Ocarina ends, Link goes back to being a child. That's the ending that we see. And as a child, Link goes to Princess Zelda, which the game then freezes. Like you'll see, it says it's speculated in one section, then in another section it says it's confirmed. So, yeah. But listen, so Link and Zelda, they meet again at the very end of Ocarina of Time in the castle courtyard, and Link now has the mark of the Triforce on his hand. So he tells Zelda what's about to happen, and Zelda says, well, look, you need to go far away. You need to go someplace else because Ganondorf is going to be looking for you, and he wants to access the Sacred Realm. So, Zelda tells the king. They find out that, Ganondorf was a cunt, and they decide to get rid of him. Many years down the road, they execute him. That's in Twilight Princess. But here's what happened to Link. Link wandered off into the forest without a fairy. He was looking for Navi. It was the Lost Woods. And what really happened in Majora's Mask doesn't say for a fact, doesn't say that Link was in fact, in this dream world of his regret and his, problems. I mean, it doesn't say that, but it's implied. And, Navi didn't get lost. Navi flies away. At the end of Ocarina of Time, Navi just flies away. And in the beginning of Majora, you see that Link is looking for a friend. And he's obviously in the woods, and it's highly speculated that, say if Majora did happen, let's just say it did, if it was real, if there really was a parallel universe that Link went to and returned from, well, that Link was forever forgotten. No one knew about the Hero of Time. No one celebrated the Hero of Time in this particular timeline. And his regret over that, as it states in Hyrule Historia, allowed him to be the swordsman whose sole purpose was to teach the new Link of Twilight Princess the moves that he knew as a way to pass down his thing, his legacy. Just to further add to that, in Hyrule Historia, it's directly stated that the Hero of Time, was never to be seen or heard from again after Majora's Mask. So, isn't this stuff really interesting? Like, I love this stuff, the theories. And it seems like Majora was the deepest and had the most psychological stuff going on there. So, and there you go. Tingle is a representation of Link. Tingle is a mutation of Link, because he's a 40-year-old man dressed as a fairy, which again is representative of the child-adult theme. So, I don't know if any of this is true, but I love it. I love talking about it. It's very interesting. So the hero is successful, and the adult era, Ganondorf is revived, Hyrule is sealed and flooded. Because the hero wasn't even around, I don't think. I have to read into that a little bit more. I haven't gotten to the Wind Waker section yet. And then there's the one, like I said, with Majora, where he's a kid and goes back to being a kid. I know it's a little bit to wrap your head around, but it is exceedingly interesting.
As Vinny just pointed out, if the adult dungeons never happened, Hyrule experiences an alternate history that we didn't get to see as it was happening, technically, but is what the plot of Twilight Princess is, the Aftermath 2. Again, none of that is a fan theory, and it's not inconsequential.
Well, it says it's speculated in one section, then in another section it says it's confirmed. So, yeah.
It's the way that the director of both Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess intended the audience to interpret their connected story, also known as canon, official. It's not a mystery, it's not hidden, it's explicitly told to you in dialogue, and it's required for properly understanding the story. It bears repeating for all the people who watched Matthew Matewitz and left it at that. Again, a lot of people just automatically assume that this is all bullshit, and their real agenda is to push this idea that video games are toys and not narrative art. But remember that with the timeline in mind, before Twilight Princess, Majora's Mask takes place. And then the main thing that got cut from the development of Majora's Mask were extensive animations for child Zelda.
I'm glad that Zelda, Ganon and Hyrule are all absent from Majora's Mask, because after Ocarina of Time, there was no need to revisit Hyrule and no story to be told there. Any direct sequel would need to be told somewhere else in order not to weaken the impact of the events in Ocarina.
It's true that the Twilight Realm specifically didn't exist in the 64 Zeldas. As I get into in Section 3, Aonuma's ready to stop making Zelda games altogether after Wind Waker. But it's provincial to assume that just because the Twilight didn't exist before this, that it automatically makes it unfaithful to his original intent when he was working on Ocarina, or to others that Aonuma was collaborating with at the time, like Koizumi and Takezawa. If you're paying attention to the story, not only do these things fit with the themes and morals from before, but it also makes sense on a literal level. If the adult dungeons never happened, like Forest Temple for example, the Deku Sprout is never planted. They pretty much beat you over the head with the differences between the Kokiri and Hylians, which culminates in this reveal. It's so over-explained, even Matthew gets it, so +1 for that. But minus several million because you missed that this was meant to cue you in to this logic being also applied to all 7 adult dungeons, not just Forest Temple. Kakariko Village, why is it a desert? Well, actually, there's technically 2 reasons that it's a desert, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On a literal level, it's a desert because of the well being drained. Kakariko's main source of water never returned. The soil's probably already rocky by nature of it being next to a volcano. This is what I mean when I say that it doesn't contradict Ocarina of Time. Eiji Aonuma was paying attention to all this stuff, and in a lot of cases more attention than fans pay, but as I've shown, that's not a high bar to clear. So, let's look at the big one, the Gerudo transforming into the Twilight. Now, some fans have suggested that the Twilight could have come from the Gerudo, but from what I can tell, no. They don't understand that this was the intended interpretation. A lot of people, including Vinny, watch the pre-Lakebed Temple flashback and assume that these interlopers are some new group of people that we've never heard of. I'm not joking, they actually take the explanation of the series' largest retcon at face value. They don't get that Midna's hair color is meant to be reflective of Twin Rova. They don't get that Midna's dialogue before the fight reflects what Naboru tells you as a child. And they especially don't understand that Zant being a male Gerudo and wanting to reestablish the patriarchy is what all of this dialogue was always about. None of this stuff is a contradiction to Ocarina of Time. It's building on what's already there. We know a male is born to the Gerudo every 100 years. When Ganondorf is banished, there's a power vacuum, so women start leading the tribe. They basically already were. Kume and Kotake were controlling everything from behind the scenes. So if only the child half of the Spirit Temple happens, and not the adult half, Noboru is still brainwashed as an Iron Knuckle. Technically, you can't visit Gerudo Valley as Child Link. There's a lot that goes unsaid about where they've been. And from Eiji Aonuma's perspective, if you came up with the whole story of Ocarina of Time, which he did, you'd want to explain what happens as a consequence. Gee, it's almost like Majora's Mask is an infamously unfinished game or something. Weird. There is a pretty good video by Max Darrett where he talks about all the Gerudo's dark magic stuff, and how in both Zelda and in Ico, there's a focus of this dark transformation magic and body horror. But again, most of that is the bleeding edge of the fandom, and even he doesn't get into everything. These 5 Zelda games really aren't that dense with story, and like I keep saying, they explicitly tell you this stuff in dialogue. The way that Fumito Ueda approached the problem is that he set it up so that the dialogue would not be necessary, kind of like a silent movie. And Eiji Aonuma reciprocated that idea, making Wind Waker more cinematic and expressive, and yeah, also including a fictional language system. Aonuma's games still mostly require dialogue because of his background, but you can see, even down to the plot details, all of this is important, like how Ganon is taking girls to the Forsaken Fortress because they have yellow hair. Exactly how Ico is taken to the Queen's Castle because he's a boy with horns. These kinds of traditions of sacrifice to ward off evil are pretty essential to Shintoism, and I really shouldn't have to tell you that Shintoism is important to something created in Japan.
For anyone who's getting Legend of Zelda vibes, it's a pretty damn different game, aside from just a couple of visual similarities.
You know, as a streamer, I like to think deeply about things.
We're on YouTube. We're not like musicians here. You know, like there's no problem.
What I've learned over the years as streaming has evolved is that we streamers are experts on a variety of topics. There's definitely stuff I would like different in the next Zelda. You know, me being smarter than Aonuma. we all are the best video game developers in our own heads, aren't we? But I do love the game, and it is the one I've had the most fun with. And what we like to do is talk about said topics with all the authority of an expert.
We're overestimating our importance in life and on the internet. We're just people that play video games and make YouTube videos. So, thank you very much.
And, you know, we do so responsibly and with tact. So, you know, as a streamer / expert, I'm telling you that ghosts can fucking time travel.
And then recycle the... Oh, wait, no, one more line. Of course, the Fumito Ueda connections don't stop there. Aonuma saves his most explicit homage to Shadow the Colossus for this fight, The Imprisoned. It's no secret that Skyward Sword is the most divisive game in the series. Let's see if those critiques are in good faith or not. So let's see if those critiques are in good faith or not.
Vinny, are you satisfied with your legacy? What the fuck kind of question is my legacy will be Picard's Goon Cave. That bit is my legacy. Oh yes, in the Academy I had a spectacular Goon Cave.
So as you can see, Zelda's connections to Ico and Ico's connections to Zelda are not optional pieces of this analysis. None of these story ideas come from nowhere, and they're not meant to seem as if they do. The only reason Nintendo fans don't know any of this is because all their gaming experience exists in a bubble. If you grew up with Nintendo, there's a good chance you never leave Nintendo, and more crucially, you never actually grow up.
Well, I'm still writing my legacy, I would imagine. I'm still creating things and making terrible memes and writing new songs, and yeah, so, you know, whatever it is, as long as I'm happy while I'm alive, I'm happy with that, and I'm pretty somewhat happy. I have an unhappy disposition at times, but I definitely consider myself to be happier than I've ever been in a lot of ways. So yeah, I'm doing okay. And when I'm dead, who gives a shit? Fuck the legacy at that point.
For anyone who's getting Legend of Zelda vibes, it's a pretty damn different game aside from just a couple of visual similarities.